Kingdom, kingdom.
Kingdom Light News with Brother Gaia.
Greetings and welcome back to Kingdom Light News, where we are here to shed light on a dark situation, perhaps even a darkened mind. Well, in my time they had paddling for bad behavior, ISS, in school suspension for bad behavior, detention, Lord, the worst, because you're missing everything and you're writing 500 sentences, hand hurting and all. In addition to the 10 Commandments that you grew up looking up to hung high on the wall. But it wasn't just the rules and law. It was the moral and ethical people who had compassion for the youth and life in general. But we cannot say the same for our teachers today. A Libertarian Catholic article, children are more likely to be sexually abused by public school teachers than Catholic priests. According to a comprehensive report by the U.S. Department of Education during the 2017 to 2018 academic year, approximately, listen to this, y'all, approximately 3.5 million students, nearly 7% surveyed, reported having had physical sexual contact from an adult, that being most often a teacher or a coach. They said it comes in various forms of abuse, ranging from verbal harassment to physical and sexual misconduct. Just disgusting, y'all. Well, the experts say reason for the prevalence is inadequate training of school district personnel, lack of consequences for administration who fail to report suspicion as regard by law. And I mean, we know this goes on because people get paid off to stay quiet and everything like that. And the inadequate training, I mean, amongst some of the things that has happened with students, these people were substitute teachers. And I think they were coming from some type of temporary service. A reluctance to ruin a teacher's life without hard evidence. That's another one. Improper follow up after an employee has been warned. The clout of teachers' unions. A desire to avoid the black eye of bad publicity. They are only taking into account that their own livelihood matters and not the safety of children. This most certainly has to stop. Being a healthcare professional in the pediatric field, any child or young child shows any signs, it gets reported, y'all. Besides, it's been recorded. Except ye be converted and become as little children, ye shall not enter into the kingdom of heaven. And whoso shall offend one of these little ones which believe in me, it were better for him that a millstone were hanged about his neck, and that he were drowned in the depth of the sea. Times are getting crazy, and the hearts of men and women are dark and shady. Before we go to our next article, it says as much in Romans, whosoever therefore resisteth the power, resisteth the ordinance of God, and they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. Police are solving fewer crimes. Why? 3 years after demands for police reform, police are solving fewer crimes. What happened? This is an article by Hadi Mawajada. In 2020, after the police-involved killings of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, millions of Americans took to the streets for months to demand for police reform. Almost 3.5 years later, a report of national crime data compiled and published by the Federal Bureau of Investigations as part of the Uniform Crime Reporting Program indicates that police departments nationwide have changed for the worse. The data says cops are solving fewer crimes today than they did then. Let's listen to our crime report.
Jeff Asher is a data analyst in New Orleans. Jeff's specialty is criminal justice agencies, and every autumn, He looks forward to getting his mitts on the Uniform Crime Report that the FBI releases. Within that report, as we said, there are numbers about the solve rate.
More or less, it means percentage of cases solved. So if your agency solves a murder from last year or from 1972, that's counted as a this year clearance. In the numerator, the denominator is just the number of murders that happened this year or the number of robberies that happened this year. So there's some weirdness, but it more or less is the percentage of crimes that are solved in a given year.
And the data shows that the solve rate is at one of its lowest ever levels?
That's correct. And you kind of have to divide the data into the sort of unbelievable 1960s and 1970s and the last 30 years or so. So in the 60s and 70s, agencies tended to report implausibly high levels of clearance rates. So frequently you'd have 90, 95, 100% of murders from an agency that's reporting 100 murders solved every year.
So many.
And it's kind of not certain why that is, but the best guesses are basically that pre-Miranda arrest standards were really low.
Do you even know the Miranda rights?
You have the right to remain silent.
Very good. You have the right to remain silent. Now what else?
Anything I say may be used against me in a court of law.
That's two. You're doing great.
You have the right to an attorney.
You got really high robbery and auto theft and all these crimes that now are being solved much less frequently were being reported at much higher levels of clearances decades ago. So things kind of, they came down in the 70s and the 80s and they kind of hit a plateau. And generally, clearance rates in the 90s, 2000s, and 2010s have been stable. The violent crime clearance rate throughout the mid-90s was around 45%, and in 2019 it was 45%. So we've seen, every year it goes up or it goes down, and there's certainly fluctuation, but it's something that for the last few decades has generally been relatively stable.
Generally been relatively stable. And if it were generally relatively stable until 2023, I don't think we'd be talking to you. What did you notice in the data that made your kind of hair stand up?
The first thing I look at is the murder clearance rate, and the murder clearance rate fell from 60+% in 2019 to just 52% in 2022.
Barely half of the murder cases in the United States, in fact, end up being solved. The national homicide clearance rate is at an all-time low, and that's according to FBI data.
That's a really large decline considering in the early 2000s, it was at that 60-something% range. It was reasonably stable at that range for a long time, and then you saw this big decline. It really declined 7% in 2020.
It has never been this bad. During the last 7 months of 2020, most murders went unsolved, and that's never happened before in America.
We don't really have good 2021 data. That's a whole different story. But we do have good 2022 data, so it went from 54% to 52% in 2022. So then I started looking at other crimes, and for all violent crimes, the clearance rate went from almost 46%, 45.5% in 2019 to 36.7% in 2022. The same thing happened with property crimes, which are solved significantly less frequently. Property crime went from a 17% clearance rate to a 12% clearance rate from 2019 to 2022. And so you look crime by crime, every crime has seen really a nosedive in the last 3 or 4 years. And so it's alarming, not because it's so much lower than it was in 1960, but because it's so much lower than it was in 2019. And you saw relative stability for decades, and that's really been interrupted.
Okay, so then the question becomes, what happened between 2019 and 2022? What do you attribute this to?
Well, that's an excellent question, and it's very easy to describe the trend. It's much harder to explain the trend. All we can really point to is that there was a substantial decline beginning really in the summer of 2020. So we can relate it to everything that's happened in American criminal justice, in policing, in attitudes towards police since the murder of George Floyd in May of 2020.
I'm tired of my black men and my black women being shot.
It was the worst thing I've ever had to witness in my life. to watch a man die on television. No human should have to die this way.
What the exact mechanism is there, what the exact cause is there, I think is really difficult to explain. It's probably something that criminologists will be trying to figure out for decades.
I think, Jeff, that people are going to sort of knee-jerk ask the question, are police officers, are police departments getting worse at what they do?
It seems like the unlawful acts pressed upon the Black American African men and women is caused by the police officers, that this is the reason why they are not reporting it. Because police officers do not want to be looked at as murderers, y'all. However, we are living in a time where, yes, they cannot be trusted, and what man in any given political office can be trusted? I mean, do you trust man? God forbid. Yes, let God be true, but every man a liar, as it is written, that thou mightest be justified in thy sayings, and mightest overcome when thou art judged. I mean, faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. We have our answer here. Love worketh no ill to his neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfilling of the law, and that knowing the time, and you know the time, that now it is high time to awake out of sleep. For now is our salvation nearer than when we believed. So again, when God returns, will he find faith? Isn't it a great time to be alive, in spirit, in flight, having a bird's eye? For it has been told, behold, the fowls of the air, for they sow not, neither do they reap, nor gather into barns, yet your, mine, our heavenly Father feedeth them. Are we not much better than they? An extremely rare half female, half male bird captured on film by Eric Rawls. This is a honey creeper with distinct characteristics of both male and female species, and is spotted as a significant moment and very rare phenomenon. It's known as a bilateral gynandromorph. Very interesting. I mean, God is definitely telling us something in nature. In fact, a saying to Salome in regards to the times. They also said it's a remarkable occurrence, and Professor Spence notes, many bird watchers could go their whole lives and not see a bilateral gynandromorph in any species of bird. Let's watch a few pics in the video. This is a stunning bilateral gynandromorph. Now, this whole article reminds me of a parable within our text in Matthew, but also of a saying of Salome, of one of Christ's sayings. The Christ within the soul, the resurrection and the life, Salome's question, how long death shall lay sway? And Salome came unto him and asked him, saying, Lord, how long shall death hold sway? And he answered, so as long as ye men inflict burdens, and ye women bring forth. And for this purpose I am come, to end the works of the heedless. And Salome said unto him, then I have done well in not bringing forth. There goes your fertility. And the Lord answered and said, eat of every pasture which is good, but of that which has the bitterness of death, eat not. There goes worldly knowledge. And when Salome asked when those things which she inquired should be known, the Lord said, when ye shall tread upon the vesture of shame and rise above desire. That's shameful passions. The two shall be one, and the male with the female shall be neither male nor female. And again, to another disciple who asked, when shall all obey the law? Jesus said, when the Spirit of God shall fill the whole earth and every heart of man and of woman. And again, another parable he put forth. The kingdom of heaven is like to a grain of mustard seed, which a man took and sowed in his field, which indeed is the least of all seeds. But when it is grown, it is the greatest among herbs, and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and lodge in the branches thereof. But of that day and hour knoweth no man, no, not the angels of heaven, but my Father only. But as the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days that were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, unto the day that Noah entered into the ark. And here at our last article, but definitely not the least, a naturalist finds hope despite climate change in an era he calls the end of Eden. The article is by Brian Mann. It's about Adam Welts. A South African naturalist, Adam Welts, traveled the world to understand how climate change is weirding ecosystems. He goes over a lot of things such as tropicalization and global warming, and the change thereof. Nevertheless, we know that we are living in the end times, and our hope is in our power. Blessings and peace. Speak to you soon.
Naturalist Adam Welts was writing his new book about climate change called End of Eden. He struggled with how to stay hopeful at a time when scientists say the world is in serious trouble. Welts told NPR's Brian Mann that one part of his answer is to keep connecting more deeply with the natural world.
On a chilly morning, Adam Welts wades through chest-high grass in New York State's vast Adirondack Park.
That's a northern flicker, right? That does the wak 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 wak.
Welts, who lives in South Africa and spent a lot of years here in New York, describes himself as an old-school naturalist who likes to dive into places full of living things.
Smelling them, hearing them, accessing them, and then figuring out maybe how they fit into a greater ecosystem.
We agreed to meet and talk about his book, End of Eden, here in one of the wildest places in the eastern U.S., because Welts says places like this help him feel hopeful in a troubled time.
You hear that?
But he says wildness like this also helps him think more clearly about climate and the risks we take pumping more and more carbon into the atmosphere. One of the big threats to this northern forest, invasive insects able to spread in devastating waves because of milder, shorter winters.
Insects that previously were confined to the more southern reaches of the U.S. are now moving into these colder areas in the northeast, just with a tiny increase in winter minimum temperatures. And they're having massive effects on these woodlands.
In his book, Welts lays out a portrait of climate change, not as one big, abstract, scary thing, but as a growing network of sometimes surprising, sometimes hard-to-see fractures or breakdowns, like those invasive bugs or like the bird species in many deserts that are vanishing because it's too hot to forage for food or care for young. Welts says he struggles with how to observe what he calls the weirding of nature without feeling despair.
Writing the book was extremely difficult at times.
How did you manage to go from that moment of feeling some of the despair to, okay, here I'm gonna write the next page, I'm gonna go on to the next step?
I'm desperately curious to see how this works out, basically. My curiosity is what's pulled me through a lot of dark times. And cheap antidepressants.
Welts says his research convinced him many wild ecosystems around the world won't survive. But he also believes despair is mostly unfounded. He says there's lots people and politicians can do to quickly reduce the use of oil, coal, and other fossil fuels. There are also ways to repair many of the growing fractures in the world. He points to this place, the 6 million acre Adirondack Park, where we're walking. It's grown a lot wilder over the last century as locals and environmentalists and government scientists created policies that protected huge areas of forest and wetlands. The goal was to protect wilderness and habitat, but along the way, Veldt says, they made the park far more resilient to climate change.
This is a much more diverse, much more stable system than it was just 100 years ago because of these efforts to protect certain areas and allow species, wild species, to reestablish themselves.
As we talk, a flock of tiny chickadees sweeps around us so close we can feel the brush of wind from their wings.
This is not effort that's been wasted. So there's an accumulation of good that comes from trying to put things back together again.
As we hike, Veldt says he hopes more people will connect more deeply to wild places like this because they're beautiful and hopeful, and because we need the natural world for our most basic needs like food and water.
Human society is completely reliant on the predictable functioning of ecosystems. We are pushing those ecosystems into unstable states, driving up uncertainty. We're pushing ourselves further and further into the unknown.
Veldt believes it'll take lots of projects, big and small, all over the world to help ecosystems begin to heal. He says that could also ease climate breakdowns like the big fires, droughts, and heat waves that are already reshaping our human lives. Brian Mann.
Light.